Dominion was asking for $1.6 billion, but this is still a substantial figure.
It's a massive number, and this was a foregone conclusion. This case was always going to settle. First, most civil cases do settle. The vast majority of them are resolved either before trial or on the courthouse steps, and it's not that unusual to resolve a case during jury selection or after. It's really, in many ways, a big game of chicken. And in this case, it is a $1 billion game of chicken. And I suspect, although I do not know, that Fox probably blinked early. And Dominion probably smelled the blood in the water and thought, well, if we hold out and simply refuse to settle even a day, and, you know, we heard there were settlement discussions yesterday, Dominion, I suspect, and we may never know, by simply holding firm and planning to go to trial, that alone can boost your settlement value. I mean, you know, the fascinating thing is we rarely get to see the inner workings of negotiation prior to trial with an eye towards settlement, but it is some of the most dramatic, fascinating stuff. I've been involved in it plenty of times, and it is really a game, a chess game of negotiation and finding the number at which both sides feel they can walk away with their ego intact and their bank account for the defendant able to survive.
And you heard Emily talk about and highlight the fact that throughout this process, of course, there was so much focus on those communications between Fox executives, between some of their top anchors, really airing what they thought of the election. And some of them expressing skepticism about what was being reported on air, casting doubt on the election results. How much of that led to this settlement and where we are today, and the fact that, as you say, Danny, Fox blinked?
I think from an evidence standpoint, the behind-the-scenes people, the producers, the people high up on the chain of command, their statements were more compelling for Dominion's case than, say, just the stars like Tucker Carlson. Far more important that a higher up in the chain of command who's involved in producing the shows where those statements were made. Far more important that they may have had doubts, serious doubts about the truth of these statements than, say, Tucker Carlson, who's really just the face of the show. But either way, this was an avalanche of really bad statements that damaged Fox. And in addition to that, Kristen, a court had already determined that the statements were, in fact, false. That is a major element of defamation that was just already decided before trial. Dominion had no burden to prove that anymore. They won on that issue. So as this case crawled along to trial, this was something Fox had to settle. And I expect towards the end, the only thing that held it up is Dominion realized that Fox had to settle, and they had that leverage where they could basically reject most of what Fox was offering. I wouldn't be surprised to learn that Fox went to Dominion yesterday to settle this case, offered them a very large number, maybe $500 million, and Dominion said, no, we want the full amount and we're going to trial. And I bet that one day of holdout probably added several million, if not dozens of millions of dollars to this settlement value. Again, we'll never know because this is the kind of thing that doesn't usually emerge. But this negotiation is high stakes in any case. In this case, this was the highest stakes negotiation, arguably ever.
Danny, thank you for that analysis. Stand by for me if you would. Let me now go to NBC News business and data reporter Brian Cheung, who's been tracking this trial as well. Brian, your reaction?
Yeah, well, when we talk about the financial impact here, there are a lot of questions about what the $787.5 million with an M settlement would do to Fox News. Would that impact the business, force them to sell anything? And what we have to understand is that this company had about $4 billion in cash as of the end of December 2022. So because of that, they can take this on the chin. They could have taken the $1.6 billion quite fine as well without having to substantially sell any sort of their assets. Now, nonetheless, that's still a large amount of money. But when you settle for half of what Dominion was asking for, maybe you consider yourself having gotten out on the easier side of things, perhaps the reason why they decided to settle. For what it's worth, what would that do to the company from a stock standpoint? There's been a lot of Wall Street notes and analysts that have been watching the progression of this lawsuit since it was filed in 2021. Bank of America Securities estimated at the end of March that for every $500 million in damages, shares of Fox Corporation would lose about $1 per share. So if you do a little bit of the back of the napkin math, a $787.5 million settlement would equate to roughly about $1.50 per share, which last I saw it was trading at about $34. So maybe that takes it down just a notch. It's not going to bankrupt. It's not going to cause this company to go under. And when you do look at some of the aftermarket moves, again, the stock market is closed as of 33 minutes ago. Shares are down by about 1.5%. So not necessarily notable movement, but it's certainly something that says that, well, shareholders clearly aren't happy about this deal.
Well, and you take me to my next question, Brian, because this is the day of the settlement. And to your point in the broader context, and that's why it's so important to have your perspective, when you think about $1.6 billion, this is something that Fox can clearly afford. At the same time, the optics of this are clearly problematic for the company. What are you going to be watching for in the coming days, in the coming weeks, as it relates to Fox's bottom line, to their stock, to get a better sense of what the impact of this long term might be?
Yeah, and Kristen, the story of this actually kind of goes back to even prior to the 2020 election. When you consider the business model of this company, this used to be a much larger media conglomerate that had the assets of 21st Century Fox, those movie studios and TV production studios that effectively subsidized the news business as well. And in 2019, they divested those assets to Disney. So they became essentially a company that relied much more heavily on the revenues coming from their TV news. And that relies a lot on the advertising dollars as well as the carrier fees that cable companies pay Fox News to carry Fox News content onto their platforms. And that's perhaps one reason why they may have leaned into the particular approach that they had with the way that they were messaging about Dominion to keep those ratings high. Now, for what it's worth, whether or not that changes as a result of this settlement might be shaded by the fact that the statement from Fox News does seem to admit that they made false claims about Dominion. But whether or not that changes the way that they operate going forward is very much a business question that the Wall Street community is actually paying attention to as well. Bank of America noting that at a minimum, the constant barrage of negative headlines should be an overhang on near-term investor sentiment. Again, that was put out prior to this settlement, but worth noting that they're watching that as well.
Definitely worth noting. Brian, Cheung, thank you so much. And Emily and Danny.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.